The ballroom at Windsor Castle had been dressed for weeks. Florists had worked through the night, threading white roses through gold wire frames that ran the full length of the East Gallery. The chandeliers, each one older than most nations, had been cleaned crystal by crystal. The footmen had practiced their positions until muscle memory replaced thought. Every fold of every tablecloth had been pressed with an iron so hot it left a faint smell of starch in the cold November air. While by 7 in the evening, the whole place was glowing. It was one of those royal evenings that looked, from the outside, like a painting. All light and jewels and people who had been trained since childhood to stand beautifully. The kind of evening that made ordinary people watching on television think that royalty must be the most peaceful thing in the world. All that quiet dignity, all that composed grace. What television never showed was the hour before the doors opened. For that hour belonged to the dressing rooms, the corridors, the whispered conversations between ladies-in-waiting, and the low, controlled arguments that happened behind closed doors, behind smiles, behind eyes that had been trained not to show a single thing they were actually feeling. That hour was where the real royal drama lived. Sarah, the Countess of Montvale, had been getting ready since 4 in the afternoon. Her suite was in the East Wing, 3 rooms down from the one that had been assigned to Lady Dorothea Ashworth, a woman she had known for 11 years and liked for approximately none of them. Their history was the kind that royal circles specialized in. Nothing dramatic enough to name openly, nothing resolved enough to forget. Just a long accumulation of small slights, competing invitations, overlapping social territories. One incident at a garden party in 2019 that both women still thought about more than they'd ever admit. But was soft, basically polite. The kind of was soft, basically polite. The kind of TBH, knock that wasn't really a knock, but a warning. Helen exchanged a look with Sarah in the mirror. "Tell whoever it's we're nearly ready," Sarah said, not turning from her reflection. Helen opened the door 2 inches, plus listened, closed it. "It's one of Lady Dorothea's people," Helen said. She's asking whether you intend to wear the Hartley tiara this evening." Funny enough, Sarah's eyes, already sharp in the mirror, went very still. The Hartley tiara wasn't technically hers. It wasn't technically Lady Dorothea's either. It existed in that peculiar royal gray zone, a piece with a complicated inheritance history, loaned between families for decades, claimed by each side through a different chain of logic. Both women had worn it at separate events over the years. Both women kept a version of the story in which it belonged, by rights to them. "Tell her," Sarah said, choosing each word with the care of a woman laying a trap, "that I will be wearing the tiara I've chosen for this evening." Helen delivered this message, came back, and she says she will be wearing the Hartley piece herself. Honestly. Oh, and the room went very quiet. Sarah set down the small brush she had been holding, looked at her reflection for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had absolutely nothing warm in it. "Then we've a problem," she said. Plus they did, in fact, have a problem. And within 20 minutes, that problem had grown legs and walked itself down the corridor, through 2 sets of double doors, past a bewildered junior footman, and directly into the attention of the royal household staff, who were already managing 17 other things and had no appetite for a 14th. The senior steward on duty that evening was a man named Collins, who had worked royal events for 22 years and believed, based on experience, that the most dangerous moments in any royal gathering never happened during the event itself. They happened in the hour before. Hungry people, overdressed people, people made fragile by nerves and too much hairspray and the pressure of being seen correctly. That combination, in his experience, produced more genuine crises than any formal proceedings ever had. He received the message about the Tiara situation with the expression of a man who had been told, during surgery, that there was also a small fire in the kitchen. Both things required attention. Neither could be ignored. Only one could be solved quickly, which Collins went first to Lady Dorothea's room, because she was the one who had sent the complaint. Lady Pretty Much, Dorothea, was already dressed, and she stood in the center of her room in a deep blue gown, her posture absolutely straight, the Hartley tiara placed on her head with the precision of a woman who had been planning this exact moment for some time. She was 63 years old, which she had been attending these events for 40 of those years. She had the kind of composure that came not from being untroubled, but from decades of practice at appearing untroubled while actually being furious. I intend to wear this piece this evening, she told Collins, before he had opened his mouth. I wore it, you know, at the Landover reception 2 years ago. There was no dispute. Collins nodded. I understand, my lady. The difficulty is that Sarah Montvale has decided, for reasons I can only imagine, to manufacture a crisis this evening out of something that was settled years ago. Real talk. I don't believe anything was formally settled, my lady. So, yeah, Dorothea looked at him. He maintained eye contact, because 22 years had taught him that the only thing worse than holding firm with these women was blinking first. I will be wearing the tiara, she said. If she wishes to wear one as well, there are many other pieces available to her. But that's just me. Collins excused himself and walked 3 doors down. Sarah was standing at her window when he arrived, which told him everything. A tiara on a velvet cushion on the dressing. Tiara on a velvet cushion on the dressing table behind her. She was, he noted, with some professional alarm, also wearing a deep blue gown. Not the same blue. Plus, but blue. These things were never accidents. I understand there's a question about the Hartley piece, he began. There's no question, Sarah said. I'd the piece reserved through the household office 3 weeks ago. I've the correspondence. Funny enough, this was new information. Collins felt something adjust quietly in his assessment of the situation. May I see the correspondence? He asked. She produced it. He read it. It was, indeed, a reservation request, addressed to the household office, dated 3 weeks ago, referencing the Hartley tiara by name. It had been acknowledged. But the problem, and there was always a problem, was that the acknowledgement had come from a junior member of the household staff who hadn't consulted the existing loan records before confirming. Lady Dorothea had a standing arrangement, informal but long established, that gave her first access to the piece for any event she was attending. 2 valid, honestly claims. 1 tiara. 35 to be fair, minutes before doors opened. Collins walked back to his station, picked up the phone, and did the thing he always did when a situation exceeded his authority to resolve. He escalated. The call went up through 2 levels of household staff and arrived, eventually, at the ear of a woman who had been managing royal complications for longer than Collins had been alive. She listened. She asked 2 questions. She said she would handle it. 20 minutes later, Princess Anne walked down the corridor. She wasn't dressed for the event yet. She had on a plain wool skirt and a cream blouse, her hair not pinned, her manner. That particular, honestly kind of brisk that meant she had better things to do and was choosing, for reasons of duty, to deal with this one first. She was, at that moment, the most competent-looking person in the building, which was saying something given that the building contained a few hundred carefully dressed people. She knocked on Lady Dorothea's door first. So I had Dorothea, and said, I've been told at Dorothea, and said, I've been told there's a dispute, you know. There's no dispute from my side, Dorothea said. I honestly, simply intend to wear what I've worn before. Sarah Montvale has a written reservation, from a junior staff member who had no authority to confirm it. That may be true, Anne said. But it's also true that the situation was handled poorly, and she acted in good faith on the confirmation she received. A pause. What I'd like to know is why this is happening. Now, at 7:15, rather than at any point. In the last 3 weeks when both of you apparently knew the other had the same intention. Dorothea said nothing. Anne looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by human behavior and had simply reached a working peace with its consistency. You knew, Anne said. You know, not an accusation, a statement. You knew, I think, and you waited. Still nothing. Right, Anne said. She turned and walked 3 doors down, and Sarah was standing at the window again. She turned when Anne entered, which her expression was more carefully neutral than Dorothea's had been, which told Anne she was more nervous, which told her something useful about who had initiated this and who had reacted to it. I understand you have a written confirmation, Anne said. I do. And I understand you've been aware for some time that Lady Dorothea also intended to wear this piece this evening. A pause, like fractionally too long. I wasn't certain what she intended, but you suspected. So yeah, and another pause. I thought it was possible, Sarah said. Anne looked at actually her, which outside in the corridor, a clock that had been ticking in the same spot for 140 years, continued to tick. Somewhere below, pretty much, the sound of an orchestra tuning up drifted through the floorboards. Here actually is what's going to happen, Anne said. Her voice wasn't raised. Plus it was, if anything, quieter than usual, which was always the sign that she meant every single word. Neither of you is going to wear the Hartley piece this evening. It will be returned to storage before the event begins. Both of you will select an alternative from the household collection, and you will do so in the next 15 minutes because that's all the time we've. And neither of you will mention this to anyone, not at this event, not at any subsequent one, and because the only people who benefit from this story being told are the ones who enjoy watching this family look ridiculous. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. Do you have questions? Sarah didn't have questions. Anne left. In the corridor, walking back toward her own suite, she passed Collins, who was standing in the exact posture of a man trying to be invisible. Sort out the paperwork, she told him without breaking stride. Make sure the reservation system has a proper sign-off chain in future. This should kind of have been caught 3 weeks ago. Yes, ma'am. She turned the corner. Gone. Plus, Collins stood in the corridor for a moment, aware that in 22 years, he had never seen a problem dissolved quite that cleanly. No raised voices, no extended negotiation, and no appeal to sentiment, or rank, or the weight of history. Just clarity. Moving fast, not wasting a syllable. So he went to fix the paperwork. At 7:55, the doors to the East Ballroom opened. The orchestra played. The guests arrived in a long, careful river of silk and wool, and carefully arranged faces. Lady Dorothea entered wearing a diamond clip piece from the household collection that suited her. If anything, better than the Hartley. Tiara would have. Sarah, I guess, entered in a pearl and gold set that her mother had worn at a similar event decades earlier, and which made 3 people stop her in the receiving line to say how beautiful it was. The sort of Hartley tiara sat in its case in storage. And you know, Princess Anne, resplendent in green, worked the room with the efficiency of a woman who had already solved the only genuine problem of the evening before it had started, and now had the luxury of enjoying the rest. No one who watched them that night, not the guests, not the cameras, not the journalists who wrote their careful, unglittering accounts the next morning, knew anything about the 40 minutes that had happened before the doors opened. They saw only the finished picture, the light and the jewels and the composed, dignified figures moving through it. They saw the painting, which they didn't see the hour that had made it possible. That was, in my opinion, as it had always been, the point. The evening continued. The speeches were made. The champagne was poured, and poured again, on two foreign dignitaries who had been placed at opposite ends of the seating plan for reasons of political delicacy, somehow ended up in conversation near the string quartet, and managed, by all visible measures, to enjoy themselves. A junior member of the household staff spilled a small amount of red wine on a tablecloth that cost more than his monthly salary, and spent the rest of the evening in a state of quiet terror that no one but Collins noticed. And in the East Gallery, near the tall windows that looked out over the darkened grounds, Lady Dorothea and Sarah Montvale stood within 6 feet of each other for approximately 40 minutes during the post-dinner reception, speaking to different people, not speaking to each other, and managing the entire thing with such practiced invisibility that even the people standing closest to them had no idea that anything other than pleasant, normal royal socializing was occurring, which was, in its own way, an achievement. The kind of achievement that doesn't get written down, the kind that only people who have been trained in it since childhood can manage. The ability to be furious and embarrassed and outmaneuvered and still stand perfectly straight. Still nod at the right moments. Still smile, actually, at the right faces. Plus, still perform the painting while the real thing burns quietly underneath. It was, as those who understood these circles knew, what the job required. Not the speeches. Not the jewels. Not the gowns. The ability to hold what was real entirely separate from what was seen. Like every evening, every event, plus every room, for as long as they were who they were. The clock in the corridor ticked. The chandelier light moved in the glasses. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the grounds of Windsor lay in darkness, quiet and old and entirely indifferent to the small, heated human dramas playing out in the rooms above them. As they always, honestly, had, and as they always would, the story didn't stay buried. Stories like that never do. Not in circles where information was currency, where the right detail dropped into the right conversation at the right moment could shift the temperature of an entire social season. The people who moved through royal events understood this intuitively, the way birds understood weather, not from thinking about it, but from years of living inside it. You developed a sensitivity to what was being said, and what was being carefully not said, and the enormous informative space between the two. By the following Thursday, the outline of the Hartley Tiara incident had traveled, not loudly, not in the tabloids, not in any official channel, not in any form that could be pointed to and named. It moved the way these things always moved in these circles, in fragments, in inference, in the raised eyebrow of someone who already knew and the carefully unasked question from someone who was learning. A lady-in-waiting mentioned to a cousin that the Windsor evening had been more eventful than usual behind the scenes. The cousin, who was connected to 4 different overlapping social networks, passed this along in a form slightly more specific. By the time the fragment had traveled its 3rd or 4th degree of separation, people who hadn't been at the event were constructing a reasonably accurate picture of what had occurred. The detail that traveled, fastest and sharpest, was Princess Anne. Not the dispute itself. That was comprehensible, even predictable, to anyone who knew the women involved. Tiara politics in royal circles had a long, exhausting, well-documented history. But the intervention, the speed of it, the economy of it, the specific quality of its resolution, that was what people fixed on. That was what kept coming up in drawing rooms and in quiet corners of clubs and in long phone calls between people who spent a significant portion of their lives analyzing exactly this kind of thing. She hadn't negotiated. She hadn't mediated. She had arrived, assessed, and decided. and the decision had held because everyone in that corridor understood that it would hold, that there was no appeal available above it, and that the alternative to accepting it was being the person who had refused Princess Anne's resolution of something this trivial at a Windsor event, which was a thing no one with any self-preservation instinct was prepared to be. This was what, people who studied power found interesting, not the force of it. Force was ordinary. Power that worked through force was blunt and eventually generated resistance. What Anne had, done was something different. She had made the outcome feel like the only reasonable outcome, had made both women feel that accepting it was a choice rather than a capitulation. Had done the entire thing in a corridor in 20 minutes, in a wool skirt and a cream blouse before the doors had even opened. What she had done, in the vocabulary of people who thought carefully about these things, was govern. Not rule, which not command. Govern, which was a subtler thing, and, in the long run, a far more effective. Lady Dorothea became aware that the story was circulating on a Saturday morning, when a friend called her under the pretense of asking about an unrelated social arrangement, and managed, within 4 minutes, to reference the Windsor evening in a way that made it clear she knew the broad strokes. Dorothea listened, responded minimally, ended the call, and sat for a while in her morning room, looking out at the garden. She looked, and wasn't a woman given to excessive self-examination. She had learned, across 63 years of navigating environments where being seen to hesitate was often more costly than being wrong, to make her assessments quickly and live with them. But the Saturday morning after that phone call, she sat with the question longer than she usually allowed herself to sit with anything. Sort of, she had known. That was what Anne had said, and that was what sat in the room with her now, on a Saturday morning, in the quiet of her own house. She had TBH known that Sarah had the written confirmation. Not from the Well household office, she hadn't looked there, but from a mutual acquaintance who had happened to mention 6 days before the Windsor event that Sarah had been particularly organized about the evening. The word organized had landed in a specific way. Dorothea hadn't investigated further, but she had also not adjusted her own plans. She had waited. Anne was right. It would resolve in her favor. Because it would resolve in her favor. Because it always had before. Plus, because she was more established in these circles than Sarah, had longer relationships, had worn the Hartley piece more recently, and had the weight of precedent behind her. Because the junior staff member's confirmation would be seen as the error it was, and her standing arrangement would be seen as the more legitimate claim. She, hadn't reckoned with Princess Anne walking down that corridor. She hadn't reckoned with the specific, impartial quality of the resolution, the fact that neither of them won, which was the only outcome that left neither of them humiliated and both of them intact for the rest of the evening. Which was, she understood now on a Saturday morning 11 days later, actually the better outcome. For both of them, even for her. She poured herself another cup of tea and looked at the garden and thought, with something that was almost but not quite admiration, that the woman was very good at her job. Sarah, meanwhile, was having a different kind of reckoning. She was 39, which was an interesting age to be in royal circles, old enough to know how everything worked, young enough to still be occasionally surprised by the gap between how it worked and how she had expected it to work. She had been in these rooms for 14 years, since her marriage to Lord Montvale had brought her into their orbit, and she had spent a significant portion of those 14 years learning the systems, the hierarchies, the unwritten rules, the ways in which formal protocol and informal power diverged, and which of those two things actually governed outcomes. She had thought, when she sent that reservation request 3 weeks before the Windsor event, that she was playing the system correctly. That she, TBH, had found the formal mechanism, the written request, the official acknowledgement that would supersede Dorothea's informal arrangement. She had been right, technically. The confirmation was real, the reservation had been valid, and it hadn't mattered. Not because of any unfairness, but because the level at which the conflict was being assessed, the level at which Anne had assessed it, wasn't the level of who had the more valid claim. It, to be fair, was the level of what outcome served this evening, the household, and the people in it. At that level, both their claims were secondary. Both of them were secondary, which the event wasn't secondary. Sarah, honestly, thought about this in the way she thought about things she found genuinely difficult, by making herself think about them correctly, not just usefully. The useful thought was that she had done nothing wrong. The correct thought was that she had done something clever that was still, in some essential way, not quite right, because its cleverness was in service of a small, competitive goal rather than anything larger. She had used the system to score a point. Anne had looked at the situation and decided the point wasn't worth scoring. TBH, these were different orientations. Plus, and the difference between them was, Sarah was beginning to understand. The difference between someone who was competent at navigating royal circles and someone who had the genuine weight of authority in them. I mean, she was competent. Anne was something else. The thought was uncomfortable. She sat with it because she was constitutionally unable to let uncomfortable thoughts go unexamined, and she found that sitting with it produced something she hadn't expected. Not resentment. Plus, something closer to clarity. Across the city, in a very different kind of room, the royal guard who had been stationed in the East Corridor on the night of the Windsor event was having a considerably less philosophical experience of the same story. His name was Thomas Hargrove, and he was 26, had been with the Household Cavalry for 3 years, and had been posted to Windsor for the first time for the November event. He had stood in that corridor for 4 hours. He had been approximately 12 feet from Princess Anne when she had walked down it, twice. Had seen the doors she had gone into and come out of. He hadn't heard the conversations inside those rooms. He had, however, seen the faces of the people who emerged. Lady Dorothea had come out of the first conversation, looking like someone who had said something they couldn't take back and was in the process of deciding how to feel about that. Not defeated. She wasn't a woman built for defeat, but recalibrated. Something had shifted in the set of her mouth, and Sarah Montvale had come out of her conversation looking, for a moment before she caught herself, like someone who had just understood something they hadn't expected to understand. That particular expression, the one that moved across a face too fast to be a performance, was one Thomas had learned to read in 3 years of standing in rooms while important things happened around him. It was the look of genuine learning, the kind that surprised the person having it. And Princess Anne had come out of the corridor, moving at exactly the same pace she had entered it, with exactly the same expression, which was the expression of someone who had done a thing and considered it done and moved on. Thomas had watched all 3 of them and thought, with the specific clarity of someone who had no stake in the outcome and therefore no reason to see it incorrectly, that he had just watched something unusual. He had been at enough events to know how these conflicts usually resolved. Either someone ceded ground under pressure and spent the rest of the evening visibly unhappy about it, or the conflict remained technically unresolved and festered in the subtext of every interaction for hours, or someone senior stepped in and issued a ruling that felt like a ruling, complete with the accompanying resentment. He had seen all 3 versions many times. For what it's worth, he knew their shapes. What he had seen in that corridor didn't have the shape of any of those versions. He mentioned this to his colleague Davies, who had been posted at the other end of the corridor during their debrief. She just sorted it, he said, aware that this wasn't a sophisticated articulation of what he'd observed. Both of them came out, and neither of them looked like they'd lost. Not gonna lie, Davies, who was 31 and had been doing this longer, nodded slowly. "When that's the thing about her," he said. "She doesn't let it become a thing. The moment it becomes a thing, she's already past it. But how did she make them accept it?" Neither of them wanted to back down. Davies thought about this for a moment. "She didn't make, in my opinion, them accept it," he said. "She made not accepting it feel like the smaller choice. There's a difference." Lolo, Thomas thought about that for a long time afterward. Thought about it on the drive back to barracks. Thought about it in the specific, persistent way of someone who had been handed a concept they didn't have a frame for yet, and was in the process of building one. He was young enough that this still happened to him, that the world occasionally produced something genuinely new to think about, something that didn't fit the categories he had. He was also self-aware enough to know that the category building itself was worth doing, that the moments when he didn't have a frame were the most important ones. He was building a frame for something about authority, about the difference between the kind that announced itself and the kind that didn't need to. In the household office, Collins had spent the week after the Windsor event doing 3 things. Fixing the sign-off chain for the reservation system, on which was genuinely overdue and took less time than it should have, because the problem was embarrassingly simple. There was no cross-reference check between new reservation requests and existing loan records. A 40-minute structural fix that had been waiting to cause a problem for years and had finally caused one. Writing the incident report, which was standard procedure for any pre-event complication that had required escalation. This was more delicate, and he had to describe what had happened accurately, include the relevant facts about both women's claims, note the resolution, and do all of it in language that was factual without being inflammatory, complete without being editorial. He had written incident reports for 22 years. He knew how to do this. The third thing he had done was harder. He had gone back through the correspondence file and traced the full history of the Hartley Tiara's loan arrangements over the past 12 years. Not because I think anyone had asked him to, but because 22 years had taught him that the situations that caused problems once would cause them again, unless someone understood the full architecture of the problem rather than just the acute surface of it. What he found was a pattern. The Tiara had been the subject of 5 separate overlapping claims across that 12-year period, none of which had escalated to the level of the Windsor incident, but all of which contained the same basic structural problem. 2 or more parties with reasonable but incompatible claims on the same piece, managed through informal arrangements that were never properly documented, resolved each time through informal negotiation that was also never properly documented, leaving the next claim with no clearer ground than the one before it. The system had been generating this problem on a slow cycle for over a decade. The Windsor incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the predictable eventual outcome of a structural failure that everyone had been too busy or too polite or too unwilling to formalize, to fix. Collins wrote a second memo. This one went to the household registrar and the senior collections officer. It proposed a formal documentation protocol for shared and contested pieces. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would change the way the pieces were used, just a clear record that could be checked before any confirmation was issued. He sent it on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, he had a reply. The proposal had been accepted and would be set up before the new year. He filed this in the folder he kept for things that had been worth doing. It was a small folder, but it wasn't empty. The week continued. Other events were planned, other complications arose and were managed, other corridors were stood in and walked through. The Windsor evening receded into the long sequence of Windsor evenings that stretched back before anyone currently working. In these houses had been born, each one complete in itself, each one taking its place in the archive, in drawing rooms and on phone calls, and in the careful, coded language of people who lived in these circles, the story continued to move. The version that circulated was generally accurate in its broad outline, and often wrong in its details, which was the usual condition of information that traveled through human networks. But the core of it, the dispute, the intervention, the specific quality of the resolution, that part held. And because it held, it worked on the people who heard it in the way that accurate stories work on people. It gave them something to think about, a reference point, and pretty much example of a thing done well. Stories like that were, in their own quiet way, instructive. Not loudly, not officially, but in the way that good examples always were, by existing, by being accurate, by being available, I think, to the people who needed a frame for the thing they were trying to understand. Thomas Hargrove, driving back to barracks on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the Windsor event, thought about what Davies had said. She didn't, well, make them accept it. She made for what it's worth, not accepting it feel like the smaller choice. He was building a frame, which it was coming together slowly. Not the way the real ones did. He sort of thought it might be the most important frame he'd built yet. 6 weeks after the Windsor evening, Lady Dorothea Ashworth attended a small dinner at the home of a mutual acquaintance and found herself seated, by an arrangement that was either deliberate or the universe's idea of humor, directly across from Sarah Montfoil. There were 12 people at the table, which the room was warm, lit by candles that had been burning long enough to settle into a steady, an amber consistency. The wine was good. The host, sort of, was the kind of person who understood that the real purpose of a dinner party was to create conditions under which the interesting thing could happen, and then step back and let it. For the first 40 minutes, Dorothea and Sarah spoke to the people on either side of them and not to each other, which was a social management strategy so practiced in these circles. That it, I guess, required no coordination. It happened the way flocking happened in birds, each individual making a small local decision that produced a coherent collective pattern without anyone directing it. By the main course, the conversational geometry had shifted, as it always did over the course of a dinner, and they found themselves participating in the same discussion about a restoration project at a house in the north that several people at the table knew. They didn't acknowledge the Windsor evening. They didn't acknowledge anything. They spoke about the restoration project, and then about the broader question of how historic houses managed the financial reality of their upkeep, and then about a particular approach to lime plaster restoration that Dorothea had strong opinions about, and Sarah had, it emerged, actually commissioned professionally some years ago. This was unexpected, not unwelcome. By dessert, they were talking directly to each other. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't things so neat or so nameable. It was two women who had been in the same orbit for 11 years, who had managed a shared irritation for most of that time, with varying degrees of success, who had both, in the 6 weeks since a November evening in Windsor, thought about something that changed the internal geometry of the irritation without eliminating it. The irritation was still present. The way a piece of furniture was present, even after you had rearranged the room. You were still aware of it, still work through around it, but its relationship to everything else had shifted. Dorothea thought, across the table, that Sarah was sharper than she had given her credit for. This was an adjustment she made precisely, the way she made all adjustments, minimally, permanently, without ceremony. Sarah thought, across the candles, that Dorothea was formidable in a way she had previously only experienced as hostile, and was now experiencing as, at least in part, impressive. This distinction mattered, to her more than she had expected it to. Neither of them said any of this. They talked about lime plaster. The host, watching from his end of the table with the satisfaction of someone whose Arrangement had produced exactly what he had hoped for, said nothing, and refilled the wine. The question of the Hartley Tiara, meanwhile, had taken on a new dimension. The formal, documentation protocol that Collins had proposed had been implemented. Every piece, in my opinion, in the household collection that had a history of shared or contested use now had a clear loan record, a simple document, cross-referenced with the reservation system that established the current custodianship and any standing arrangements attached to it. Nothing elaborate, just a record. The kind of thing that should have existed for years and hadn't, because the people responsible for it had been managing so many things simultaneously that the structural maintenance had kept getting displaced by the immediate operational needs. This was, in Collins's experience, how most institutional problems worked, not from malice, not from incompetence, from the persistent urgency of the present, crowding out the quiet importance of the structure. The acute kept displacing the chronic until the chronic became acute. The Hartley Tiara's new documentation revealed something interesting. The piece had 3 parties who held some form of legitimate historical claim on it. Dorothea's standing arrangement, which dated back 15 years. A second arrangement with a different family that had been superseded but never formally closed, and a household acquisition note from the 1990s that muddied the provenance in ways that would take some time to properly resolve. Collins brought this to the senior collections officer. They spent an afternoon with the records. What they found, at the bottom of a file that hadn't been opened in 11 years, was a letter. Formal, handwritten, dated 2001, from the third party's family formally releasing their claim on the piece. The letter had been received, filed, and never acted on. The superseded arrangement had simply remained in the system, generating ambient confusion for 2 decades, because no one had taken the 15 minutes required to close it out. 15 minutes, 23 years of ambient confusion. Collins, I think, sat with this for a while. Then he closed it out, filed the release letter properly, updated the record, made a note in the new protocol document explaining how the piece's status had been clarified and what documentation existed. 2 claims pretty much now, not 3. Dorothea's standing arrangement, clearly documented, and a note in the system that future reservations would need to be coordinated with her directly before any confirmation was issued. It wasn't a complete resolution of the original conflict. The question of whose claim was more legitimate, Dorothea's long-standing informal arrangement or the kind of written, formal reservation that Sarah had made, wasn't one the documentation could settle. That was a question of policy, and policy was above Collins's authority to set. But the documentation meant the question would never again be resolved in a corridor 12 minutes before an event opened. That was what the protocol was for. Not to eliminate conflict. Conflict in these circles was structural, built into the overlapping claims and informal histories and competing precedents that accumulated over decades. The protocol was to move the conflict to a place where it could be engaged with properly, where it had time, where it could produce a decision rather than an incident. Collins sent a note to Princess Anne's private secretary, summarizing what had been found and what had been done. It was the standard notification that went up the chain when a procedural matter was resolved. 2 paragraphs, factual. The reply came the same afternoon. 2 words. Good. Thank you. He put it in the folder. Thomas Hargrove had been thinking about authority, not in the way recruits were trained to think about it. The formal vertical structure, the chain of command, the clear hierarchy of rank. He understood that version. He had been trained in it. It, in my opinion, functioned, and he respected it. And it wasn't what he had seen in the Windsor corridor. What he had seen was something that operated across ranks rather than through them. Something that wasn't about position, although position was part of it. Something that had to do with the quality of a person's engagement with a situation, the degree to which they were actually present in it, thinking about it correctly, moving toward its actual resolution rather than toward a version of events that made them look good or feel vindicated. He had been in rooms with people who had positions. He had been in rooms with people who had authority. These were often, he was learning, different rooms. He talked, basically, and about this with Davies more than once over the following weeks. Davies, who was older and had thought about these things longer, was a useful person to think with. He didn't simplify, and he didn't pretend the complications weren't there, which made his occasional clarities feel earned. "The thing about the ones who have it," Davies said once, over tea in the barracks common room, "is they're not performing anything. They're not managing you. They're just, in my opinion, I'm thinking about the actual problem. And because there, you think about the actual problem too. And the actual problem turns out to be solvable. And the ones who don't have it," Davies looked at his tea, "they're thinking about what the situation means for them, where it puts them, how it looks. And because you start thinking about that too. And suddenly you're not solving anything anymore. You're just negotiating positions." Thomas thought about this, about Dorothea and Sarah in that corridor, each of them very much thinking about where the situation put them, and about Anne, who hadn't been thinking about that at all, who had arrived in the corridor with a completely different question, not who's right, but what resolves this, and had found the answer quickly because it was a much simpler question than the one the two women had been trying to answer for weeks. "How do you get there?" Thomas asked. "To the place where you're thinking about the actual problem?" Davies considered. "I think you have to be genuinely indifferent to who wins," he said. "Not in the sense of not caring about the outcome, in the sense of not caring whether the outcome is called your win or someone else's. If you're invested in who gets credit, you're already off the actual problem. You're honestly on the story about the problem." Thomas filed this carefully. He's arrived in pieces, from different angles. Arrived in pieces, from different angles. Each piece connecting to the ones before it, until eventually, not today, not soon, but eventually, the picture was complete enough to use. He was building a frame. He had been building it since November. Plus, he thought pretty much it would hold. The February event at Kensington was the first major gathering of the new year. It was smaller than Windsor, sharper in its guest list, and had the particular atmosphere of a post-Christmas royal occasion. People were slightly more human in February, slightly less polished than they had been in the autumn, willing to be warmer and more direct than the November formality allowed. Like, Sarah attended. Actually, Dorothea attended. Plus, they arrived within 4 minutes of each other, but stood in the receiving line at a distance of 2 people, moved through the first hour in their separate orbits, as they always had. An hour into the reception, near the tall east windows, Sarah found herself standing beside Dorothea at a drinks table during a lull between conversations. They stood. "Look there for a moment." "The lime plaster specialist," Dorothea said. "The one you used. Was he the actually Whitmore firm?" Sarah looked at her. "Yes, actually. I've been considering them." A pause, not awkward. Assessment. "Were they reliable?" "Extremely," Sarah said. "And they had people who actually understood the period material, not just technically, aesthetically." Dorothea nodded once, the nod of someone registering genuinely useful information. "I may ask for the contact." I gotta say, of course. They picked up their drinks. The social current moved them apart, as it always did, are carrying each of them toward the next conversation, the next face, the next moment in the evening's long, gentle current. Nothing was resolved. Everything was exactly as complicated as it had always been. The histories and hierarchies and competing claims on pieces and precedents. Invitations were all still there, intact, waiting for the next occasion to arrange themselves into a new configuration. But something had shifted, not eliminated. Shifted. The way furniture shifts after a rearrangement. Same pieces, different relationship between them, different quality of the space. Princess Anne, across TBH the room, was in conversation with a foreign ambassador's wife. She listened. She asked a question that was the exact right question. She laughed at something that was apparently genuinely funny. She didn't look toward the east windows where Sarah and Dorothea had been standing. She didn't need to. That conversation had been over since November, as far as she was concerned. Filed. Resolved to the extent it could be resolved. No longer requiring her attention. She had other things to attend to. She always did. The evening continued its course. The wine moved, kind of, through the room, and the conversations rose and fell. The pretty much orchestra played something that had been composed 200 years earlier, for rooms that looked very much like this one, and the sound of it moved through the air with the comfortable authority of something that had been working for a long time and saw no reason to stop. Thomas Hargrove stood at his post near the main entrance, watching the room with the specific quality of attention he had been training himself toward. Not the attention of someone waiting for something to happen, but the attention of someone genuinely looking at what was already there, learning its shapes, understanding how it moved. Thought he was 26, plus he had been doing this for 3 years. He had decades ahead of him in rooms like this one, standing at the edges of the things that actually happened, while the things that were supposed to happen occupied the center. He thought about the corridor at Windsor, and about the shape of authority that had moved through it. He was still building his frame, and he thought, this is the part of the education that no one tells you about. Not the training, not the procedure, which not the chain of command or the order of precedence or the correct way to stand at attention for 4 hours without your feet sending you a formal complaint. The part where you learn to see, to look at a room full of people managing their positions and their histories and their carefully arranged presentations of themselves and understand, not intellectually but practically in your body, in the way you moved through the space, what was actually happening, who had weight and who was managing the appearance of weight, who was thinking about the problem and who was thinking about the story about the problem. The part actually, where you learned the difference. He stood at his post. The room moved around him. The chandeliers made the crystal sing softly whenever someone walked too close. Outside the windows, the February city was cold and dark. The streets lit in amber, ordinary life moving. Through it, the way it always did, but unaware of and uninterested in what was happening in this room. Look, the evening continued. It would continue for another 2 hours. Then the cars would come. Then the lights, would dim. Then the room would be restored to its pre-event configuration by people who worked through the night and left no evidence of themselves in the morning, only the clean space they had returned to order. And look, then it would be ready for the next one, as it had always been, as it would always be. The rooms endured. The events passed, through them. The people came and went with their Tiara disputes and their lime plaster specialists and their carefully maintained public faces and their private reckonings, their small adjustments, their slow recognitions. And somewhere in all of it, if you stood in the right corridor at the right moment and watched with the right quality of attention, you might catch a glimpse of something worth understanding. Not loudly, not officially, but there, real, moving fast, not wasting a syllable. The clock in the corridor continued to tick. It had been ticking for 140 years. It, to be fair, would tick for 140 more. That, in the end, was the only thing that was certain. Everything else, the claims, the disputes, The resolutions, the small human dramas that flared and faded and were filed away. All of it was temporary. All of it was passing through. The rooms remained. And the people who understood that, who held their position within it with the right combination of firmness, lightness, who knew that the point was never the tiara and always something larger. Those people were the ones the rooms remembered. Not by name, not in any record Collins would file, but in the quality of what they left behind when they were gone. In the frame someone built, 26 years old and 3 years into a long education, standing. At the edge of a room in February, watching and learning and slowly, carefully, beginning to understand. You know,